Hello, and another installation for your greenhouse vegetable class. Today's topic is food safety. Um, you may think, oh my goodness, why are we talking about this? It's a big deal in any part of food production, and produce is just as heavily regulated as any other. And so, if you end up in a vegetable farm or greenhouse, you're going to run into this stuff. So, this is my first introduction to you to this whole field. So, um, food safety is a really big field, anywhere from pesticide residues to bacteria to heavy metals and fertilizers, you name it. There are laws and limits and all sorts of guidelines. Um, and that comes about because of the statistics. This is from the World Health Organization, WHO. This is, I think, 3 years old. I haven't updated it, but I think the numbers speak for themselves. Um, Around 600 million illnesses around the world, 420,000 deaths, 125,000 are children under the age of 5. And if you watch the news, you would have heard that there was a death in Scarborough yesterday of a 3-year-old girl from food poisoning. Um, they're often considered diarrheal diseases, right? So they can be viruses like a norovirus. But the ones we're most concerned about when in the greenhouse sector are your salmonella and your E. coli bacteria. So some headlines that have hit the news over the last couple of years have been a big deal. You know, romaine lettuce, if you remember, actually, romaine lettuce and field lettuce from California seems to hit the news every couple of years. But last year we had a big deal with E. coli, and there it took quite a while for the whole process to flush out, and there was a real shortage of lettuce last summer. And as a result, actually, field lettuce in California has lowered its production, and a lot of it has shifted to greenhouses. Greenhouse lettuce grown, greenhouse grown lettuce square footage has gone up significantly in North America and around the EU as well. Um, so, so what is this and who needs it? So the two main ones we talk about in Canada are HACCP and Canada GAP. They're both what are considered food safety standards, and basically they're a series of protocols that are designed to reduce the risk of contamination and transmission. So these protocols are supposed to, first of all, prevent, but also make it easier to recall a product. So everything's identified by lots, etc. And when there's an issue, it can be traced right back to the entire process of who picked it, who packed it, who washed it, etc., etc. And then we can figure out what went wrong. Um, there are many standards around the world. The WHO has what's called a Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, and those set out base standards, and then the various organizations have differing levels of scrutiny. But Canada GAP and HACCP, you may also have heard of Good Manufacturing, GMP. This is used in the cannabis industry, partly because it's medical, so things are ramped up even more. Um, but they are required by food retailers, right? So food safety is governed in Canada by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. You can tell by the name that that's their job. um, and so ultimately the buck stops with CFIA, but the whole process of safety certification is voluntary, believe it or not. It doesn't mean you're exempt from the laws. You know, if the CFIA showed up at your farm and you failed the test, you could have some pretty serious fines, and they may even put you out of business. But generally speaking, the people who are buying your produce would be the ones that would require that. So it's voluntary, but if you sell to a reseller or a wholesaler or a marketer, they 100% will require that you have some form of food safety certification, right? So if you're an organic grower and you go to the farmer's market, is certification required? No. There's no in-between retailer. There's no large corporation. It's just the consumer and the farmer, or some summer student on the other side of the table. And the trust is at that level. Now, the flip side is if you get sick, in theory, you know exactly who to go to, right? Um, Now, when you go to a grocery store, there's a huge industry and layers of companies and people between you and the farmer, and we need to know where things went wrong. And so all wholesalers and retailers require food safety certification. Um, Lawsuits are a big deal. You know, people look at a company like Loblaws and they say, "Oh, they're rich. I got diarrhea. I'm going to sue them." And you know, most of us would say, you know, let's just move on. I don't have time for this. But these things happen, and a lot of money transfers between, and you know, laws are what they are. So in Ontario, there is an association called the Ontario Greenhouse Vegetable Growers that licenses growers, packers, and marketers. And many farms are all three of those. And so they carry all three licenses. And part of that licensing, there's around 210 growers, 36 marketers, and packers in Ontario. And yeah, like I said, OGVG requires that they all have third-party certification. Now, most growers go with Canada Gap, not necessarily HACCP, except farmers or growers that ship to the United States. They will use HACCP certification. Now, I'll explain in a second that Canada Gap actually has all of HACCP elements in it, so it kind of is immaterial. Um, HACCP stands for Hazardous Analysis Critical Control Point, right? So this is, as it says here on the slide, it's a systematic approach that is focused on prevention, right? We're not trying to cover our butts. We're trying to prevent something. And Canada Gap has all the same principles included. They both are part of the United Nations program and recognized by their laws. So you can ship elsewhere in the world, assuming the retailers and their lawyers accept your particular certification. But HACCP is used by most countries, Western countries at least, and has been around for quite some time. So the idea is that it goes beyond just inspecting the finished product, right? There's steps all along the whole process where things are inspected to make sure that they meet basically criteria for safety. Um, and yes, they can be both physical, so things like objects, they can be chemical, and they can be biological. A lot of farms now actually have to x-ray their produce to make sure there's no foreign material. Uh, there was some, and not recently, but in years past, there was like disgruntled employees that threw like a razor blade or a pin in the produce trying to get their company in trouble to hurt them because they were unhappy. That's pretty twisted. But at the end of the day, the companies can't take the risk, so they have to x-ray everything and make sure that there's no foreign material. And if an alarm goes off, that lot is set aside or just automatically destroyed. Um, and then, of course, chemicals, the farms themselves know what chemicals they're using, so they have to keep an eye on that. But the biggest one, the most common one, is biological, right? So that starts with, you know, the bathroom, basically, people not washing their hands, and then going out and picking produce, putting in a cart, and then that goes into a package, and someone gets sick. Um, so we're going to go over the 7 steps of HACCP, the principles. The first one is a hazard analysis, right? So what you do here is you identify all possible food safety hazards that could occur on your farm. You put in place those measures to, you know, identify and quantify your risks. So, for example, this is a cherry tomato washer. So the idea is that cherry tomatoes are dumped in this end and they slowly move through bubbling water, and then they're collected on the other side and they head off for drying and packaging. And it's the whole point of this is to eliminate the risks of E. coli being on the surface of the cherry tomato. right? So produce washing prior to packaging is often identified as a place, right? So are the pathogens surviving, right? Is there inadequate purification of the rinse water? So that's that's you identifying a step, right? So principle two, the second principle is identifying critical control points. So, something as simple as staff wearing disposable gloves when they're handling the produce reduce risks if their hand washing is inadequate. Um, that would reduce the input stage to the rinse as a factor. But going back to it, washing being a critical control point means that we need to deal with the hazard of bacteria surviving that water purification, right? So the critical control point then would be what's the limit at which the hazard is acceptable without compromising safety? So we have to establish critical limits. And that could be something as simple as a ppm of chlorine or hydrogen peroxide in the wash water. So an employee would take regular samples of the water to make sure that they are at the correct ppm levels. And they might also have to have a timer to watch how long the produce is in the wash water. So they might throw a dummy produce in and time to see how long it takes to pass through it. So principle four being the monitoring procedures, right? So these procedures are identified, they're detailed, and they are documented, right? So that we have critical control limits. That's the key. It has to be written down, and then it has to be enforced. A lot of this is common sense. I understand that, but when you have a lot of employees running around and stuff goes wrong, procedures are really important to make sure stuff happens. So going back to our example for principle four, um, we're monitoring procedures for washing, and that would be testing for ppm or of chlorine, for example, right? There's our test kit. We're going to do a ppm test every hour or whatever your protocol says. And then you're also going to throw a dummy test pepper or tomato in the wash, and you're going to time it and see what was its exposure time. And according to your protocols, was it in the wash water for the minimum required exposure time in order for that fruit to be sufficiently washed? So the fifth principle is establishing corrective actions, because it's one thing to monitor, and what do you do now if you do a ppm of chlorine and it's below the whatever 3 or 5 ppm that's required? What do you do? So the protocols tell you what to do. It's not up to you, because you don't want to take on that responsibility, because that can get really expensive. The protocol says this is what you're required to do. This is the action, right? Uh, so in the sense, what we're looking at here is the actions that are taken, right, that will put the thing back on track in such a way that uh, you're not letting produce get through your process, right? So if, for example, you test your chlorine and it's below the ppm limit, well, you know that you've been packing for an hour and you've failed the test. So everything from the previous test point to this test point, in theory, needs to be washed again. So that would be a very costly mistake, because you'd have to unpack everything and put it through the wash process again. Before doing that, obviously making sure that the rinse water has met the minimum requirements, and then washing it in and pack it again, right? These have to happen before it leaves the farm. Uh, correct it before the end stage production has happened. Ideally before it's sealed in a bag. That's a big problem, right? Then everything has to be undone. It's going to be an unhappy day at the farm. Um, so in other words, produce is diverted for a second wash. So verification procedures, principle 6. This is where basically your procedures that you would do with your testing. So there's your standard ppm testing and your quality control time testing. But a lot of companies will also do a bacterial culture test periodically to make sure that the water is sterile, and not just ppms, to make sure that, say your ppm kit's wrong. So they periodically will have that checked. and it's just another layer of protection to make sure that you don't get in trouble. Um, this may seem excessive, but a food poisoning incident can potentially put your entire company out of business. If your large retailer drops you because you're a liability and others catch wind, maybe at some point no one will buy from you and you have to sell through someone else and take a massive cut in your price. It could be the end of your business. So verification activities also ensure that your monitoring and corrective actions are in fact working. And of course, that's all written in your program, your policies and procedures. Um, and record keeping basically is the underpinning of the entire process, right? There's lots of clipboards. It seems crazy, but it has to be done. And like I said at the very beginning, record keeping all the way through the whole process is really essential for being able to track problems. Now, a lot of farms track who harvested it, who packed it, who washed it, and who weighed it, and who loaded on the truck. And they'll even track the temperature of the truck, who the driver was, and how long it was in the truck. This is all done with remote disposable sensors that log things like RFID scans and temperature and humidity. That's all kept and tracked and logged so that if there is a problem, they can drill back to what happened. And that's a core element of Canada Gap or HACCP. And that is essentially what falls under record keeping. Now, a lot of companies use that information to track things like productivity as well. So it's not just for food safety. They can see, how quickly produce is harvested, how long it takes to go through packing, and they can see which staff are more effective than others, and then management would then go and have a chat with staff that are not keeping up with production levels that are expected. You may or may not feel comfortable with that, but at the end of the day, running a business means people got to work. They can't just stand around chit-chatting. Stuff's got to happen, right? So the protocols in place are used also for business management. But and in the event that you have a CFI inspection, you have all the records in place to satisfy their expectations. And so you shouldn't have any fines or suspensions or your export license taken from you. Yeah, all these things are monitored, stored, typically electronically, and oftentimes the individual employees have to do a log sheet and they have to include their signature that they've done the work themselves. It's not done anonymously. Everyone's name is done. It could be just your employee card is swiped or tapped so that the system knows who's there and who's monitoring it. Now, as far as growers are concerned, depending on the size of the farm, you may or may not actually have a lot of duties in this, but most growers are involved with monitoring their staff, their productivity, their hygiene, like do they actually wash their hands at the bathroom? Do they come from lunch directly to their work areas, or do they wash their hands before coming to the greenhouse? Are they wearing gloves if that's your policy? Are they wearing hairnets? You name it. Whatever your farm's policy, that's your job. Some growers do end up also working in the packing area to ensure that everything moves smoothly. So it just depends on the size of the farm and where you are sort of in the pecking order. But record keeping is critical. And I'm sure you'd get tired of this kind of stuff, especially now with COVID. But the reality is, washing hands is probably the most important step in food safety. Not many farms require staff to wear gloves when they're harvesting the produce. And so obviously having clean hands is the very first step. And this is what, in California, a lot of the problems we've had with lettuce, this has been linked back to this particular problem. So it's really vital that signs are posted and that people are monitored. Often management has cameras. This sounds again onerous, but there's so much at stake that will monitor the staff washing their hands in an area before they go into their lunchroom or before they go to the work area. So the sinks are usually not in the bathroom, they're located outside, and that way they can be monitored because they obviously don't want cameras in the bathroom. But the farms that I've been mostly involved with have cameras in the hand wash area outside the bathrooms. And again, if a manager sees a habit, then they're going to pull someone aside and they're going to say, hey, you're not washing your hands. Either you change your behavior or you find another job. So yeah, Canada Gap and Haccp, really, really important in greenhouse vegetable production, whether it's lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, eggplants, you name it. There's always food safety on the minds of management. It's really, really, really important.